It had been 10 years since I had last seen Steve, 10 years since he walked out of my mother's life. But now, here he was, standing in the hospital corridor, looking just as fit, just as ruggedly handsome as I remembered. His eyes found mine, and in that moment, something shifted. "Janet?" His voice was warm, familiar, laced with something I couldn't quite name. I smiled, my pulse racing. Steve. I should have thought of him as my mother's ex, but all I could see was a man who made my breath catch. The days that followed were a blur of memories, late-night texts, and undeniable attraction. It wasn't innocent, not really. I told myself I was just craving attention, something my husband, Jim, had long stopped giving me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. So when Jim left for his weekend with the lads, I did something reckless. "Come over." Steve hesitated. "Janet, I don't think... It's just dinner, just catching up." I could hear the hesitation in his silence. Then, finally, "Okay." My heart slammed against my ribs. I don't know if it was the wine, the dim lights, or just the way he looked at me, but the air between us became charged. We sat on the couch, close. Too close. "You still didn't tell me why you left my mother." Steve exhaled. It was complicated. I reached for my glass, my fingers brushing against his hand. The electricity was instant. We both froze. His gaze dropped to my lips. I swallowed hard. I wanted him. God, I wanted him. And then, Steve leaned in. I felt the warmth of his breath, the tension coiling between us like a spring about to snap. My lips parted, but just as our mouths were about to meet, he pulled away. "I can't." His voice was hoarse, pained. I blinked, dazed. "What?" "Janet, you're my ex-girlfriend's daughter." I shook my head. "That was 10 years ago. It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me." The rejection stung, but it wasn't anger I felt. It was understanding. Steve wasn't like my husband. He wasn't careless. He wasn't thoughtless. He wanted more. And that night, as I lay awake in my empty bed, I realized something. I deserved more too. Sleep didn't come that night. I stared at the ceiling, Steve's words echoing in my head. "I can't. It matters to me." But what about what mattered to me? For 2 years, I had been invisible in my own marriage, craving something I thought was gone forever. But then Steve came back into my life, and suddenly, I felt alive again. I wasn't ready to let him walk away. Not without a fight. The next day, I texted him. "Me. We need to talk. Just us." Steve. "Janet." I didn't let him finish. "Me. Please, just one more time." A long pause. Then Steve. "Okay." My heart slammed into my ribs. I waited for him at my favorite coffee shop. When he walked in, I knew. This wasn't over. He sat across from me, silent, guarded. "You don't have to fight this," I said softly. "Janet, you don't understand." "No, Steve, you don't understand." He frowned, but I could see it. The way his fingers clenched, the way his jaw tightened. "You're acting like what we feel is wrong. But tell me, does it feel wrong?" Silence. I leaned closer, my pulse racing. "I want this. I want you, and I know you want me too." I thought, I want to do something just for myself for once. His breath hitched. Our eyes locked. And then, I kissed him. For a second, he didn't move. Then his hand slid into my hair, and he kissed me back. Hard, desperate, like he'd been starving for this. The drive back to his house was a blur of stolen glances and shallow breaths. The second the door closed behind us, we collided. His hands roamed my body like he was trying to memorize every inch. My fingers tangled in his hair, my lips tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice rough, unsteady. I looked into his eyes, my heart pounding. "Don't stop." And he didn't. Not that night. Not ever again. I woke up tangled in warm sheets and regret. Steve lay beside me, his breathing deep and steady, his arm draped across my waist. For a fleeting moment, I let myself feel it, the comfort, the rightness. But then reality came crashing in. Jim, my son, my marriage, my mother. I slowly pulled away, my heart hammering. What have I done? Steve stirred, his fingers reaching for me. Leaving so soon, he murmured, eyes still heavy with sleep. I forced a smile. I should go. He sat up, his expression shifting. Janet, I just need time to think, okay? He nodded, but the doubt in his eyes unsettled me. As I dressed, something deep inside me whispered, you crossed a line you can never uncross. At home, Jim barely noticed me. The usual. Football, work, the lads. But I noticed me. I saw myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My skin still tingled where Steve had touched me. My lips still burned from his kisses. But inside, I was twisting, because no matter how much I justified it, it was still a betrayal. That night, my phone buzzed. Steve, I can't stop thinking about you. My chest tightened. I wanted to see him again. I wanted to run into his arms and forget the world. But I also wanted to undo it all, to go back. I sat in my car outside Steve's apartment. I told myself I was there for closure. But deep down, I knew the truth. I needed answers. I knocked. He opened, our eyes locked. You regret it, he said, his voice hollow. I swallowed hard. I don't know what I feel. He stepped closer, his heat wrapping around me. Then why are you here? I exhaled. Because I don't know how to stop. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Steve's fingers brushed my cheek, his voice low and raw. Neither do I. I never thought walking away from Steve would be this hard. But I knew I had to. The air between us had been thick with longing, charged with an undeniable force we both felt but couldn't act on. He had been my mother's past, and I was a married woman. The weight of what happened, of what could still happen, threatened to consume me, but I couldn't let it. We met at a quiet cafe, far from anyone who might recognize us. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. When he looked up, our eyes met, and my breath caught in my throat. Janet, he said softly. His voice was laced with something I couldn't quite place. Regret. Longing. Both. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. I had rehearsed this in my mind 100 times, but now, face to face, the words felt impossible. We can't do this again, I finally whispered. Steve sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but knowing didn't make it easier. For a few moments we sat in silence, the space between us filled with everything we weren't saying. The tension, the desire, the heartbreak, it was all there, lingering like smoke after a fire. When I finally stood to leave, he reached for my hand. His touch sent a spark through me, but I gently pulled away. Take care of yourself, Steve. I walked out before I could change my mind. I returned home to Jim that night. He barely looked up from his laptop when I walked through the door. I kissed my son goodnight and climbed into bed beside my husband, who didn't even notice the war raging inside me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Steve had looked at me, the way his fingers had almost laced through mine. I wanted him. I still did, but I had made my choice. Days turned into weeks. I threw myself into routine, caring for my son, making conversation with Jim, pretending that everything was fine. I became an expert at smiling, at nodding in the right places, at pretending that a part of me hadn't been left behind in that cafe with Steve. But at night, when Jim was asleep beside me, I would touch my lips and remember the kiss that never was. I would close my eyes and see Steve's face. I would dream of what might have been, only to wake up with the weight of reality pressing down on me. I never saw him again. He never reached out, and I never searched for him. But I knew, deep down, that he still thought of me, just as I thought of him. This fire between us, it was never truly extinguished. It simply became something I had to carry alone, a secret buried deep inside me, where no one would ever find it and where it would burn forever.